a lot of people have like different ideas like what makes a robot. So like in your own words, like what do you think like robots are?
Be a lot of different things, but what I think of often is something that does what it's told very successfully and repeatedly. So one way I think that robots will make a big impact is.
Welcome to Happiness in the City. This is Barbara, and today I would like to focus our attention on a very important topic, and that is will. There's a lot of talk about voting and selection of leaders, choosing certain things because they are popular, but there is very little intelligent discussion about desires and methods of choosing those desires and classification of those desires and the nature of the will that we use to make decisions. Just to say, oh, we have to defend democracy, or democracy this, democracy that, that's very simplistic. Because when you study history of political philosophy, you understand the nature of authority as much more complex than just will and desire of a certain group of people who want to exert authority on a given topic or area. So we have, let's see what Wikipedia says about this. I like definitions in Wikipedia because it really is just an effort to bring in to our minds heritage and knowledge of the ages so we can develop. And many other social media does that. I love the fact that there are most of the political philosophy books, classical political philosophers on YouTube, and that has been very therapeutic for me. I've been dealing with need to refresh some of the great knowledge I got from my university education, but not only university education. And I found that this way of refreshing it is very joyful. Wikipedia clearly is a work of tremendous love of learning, and people who put it together created an amazing, incredibly awesome way to access very complex knowledge. So I always praise anything about Wikipedia, and I encourage you to support it because it's worth continuation, because it's just so necessary in our modern world discussions to have a place where we can calmly refer to for classical definitions and basic knowledge that we can then develop. And here you have a very complex definition right here. So we do it on fade. Okay, will generally is that faculty of the mind which selects. Okay, so the beginning of the definition talks right there about selection. Now, why is this important? Because in order to have will, we have to understand that it has opportunities to select certain things. In contrast to a situation which there is no selection, so then we cannot apply will. I have a situation in my personal life in which I was on a job, having a good time, working for the Washington Post, having connection with the whole world, and then in a moment of error, a car accident happened, and the entire destiny of my life was altered. Thank God that I survived it. But that was a situation in which there was no opportunity to select anything. So a situation of accidents or similar circumstances are places where there is no possibility to apply will. And we sometimes forget that not everything in our personal lives, in our social lives, political lives, national lives, is a matter of will. Because there are some circumstances in which we cannot make any decisions because there are higher forces at play that make those decisions for us. And we are dealing, for instance, with a tragedy of hurricanes, horrible forest fires in California, and that was a situation in which people who were negatively affected by those disasters had no choice in the matter. So before we continue to further aspects of this decision, let's think about those matters of selection. How are relationships between will and selection possible? In other words, before we can go to further aspects of the meaning of will, we have to understand that relationship between will and alternatives of diverse things that the will can be applied to. I will give you an example from will as testament. My mother wrote a testament in which she bequeathed everything she owned to her two children, me and my brother. So she had a choice in this matter because she could have bequeathed it to somebody else or to some social cause, and she chose to make sure that her biological children succeed to her ownership of whatever she had while on earth, and in this way her will, my mother Sophia will, excluded people who were not her biological children or descendants of children, her grandchildren. So this is a situation in which will was applied because there was selection. It was possible to make those decisions. Now, there are situations in which there is no will, and traditionally courts naturally apply the heritage to biological immediate family members. So that is also an application of the will of legal and financial authority to a situation in which there would be no testament. And where does that selection come from? From thousands of years of experience with such matters. In other words, there is a certain understanding that in the natural law we have to give privilege to our biological families. There's even a commandment about it: honor thy mother and thy father, and it's the fourth commandment. It's the first commandment that refers to matters of life, after the three first commandments about God Himself and our relationship to God. So, to God, this is also very important. And yet, He gives that freedom of the will by giving the selection of honoring our mothers and fathers, or ignoring it and dishonoring it. Obviously, in the matter of selection, there may be items that will bring benefit if we will the application to a particular situation, or there may be items that will destroy the goodness that we expect from application of a will. So we have to think about this relationship between the will, power that is needed to use the will, and the selections and the nature of things that are within baskets of diverse things that the will can be applied and make a decision. So when we have a complex society, complex political society, we have now complex models of social communications in amazing popularity, and we can access this. There are many other very complex things and situations in which application of the will is possible. But then there are also those in which application of the will is not possible because there is nothing to select. So then there's this matter of obedience to a situation in which application of a will is impossible. And I think we have to understand that, because there are now many situations in which people judge, sometimes even condemn another person for their will, but in fact they were in a set of circumstances in which they had no choice. They had nothing to select. They had to yield to a compelling situation or decision and then pay for whatever the outcome is. Sometimes this outcome is good. Sometimes there are circumstances in which we have to take authority and create a way out of danger, because if we waited for application of individuals' will in a dangerous situation, it would be too late, and probably they wouldn't even survive. So in order for us to understand the concept of justice, we have to understand the presence of will in the context of justice. And I encourage you to read in political philosophy books about that matter and how diverse centuries and diverse philosophers dealt with this particular situation and this particular concept, and applications of this concept of the will to daily life, to politics, to relationships. We have a huge literature in which many great writers dealt with that conflict between will, lack of will, and authority. And the most famous, of course, is William Shakespeare. And the tragedies and comedies and other dramas, they all create multi-dimensional stories in which you see how diverse characters deal with decision making. For instance, we have a very famous Macbeth, and he decides to apply his will in a situation which he had selection to be made. He could spare the life of the ruler or destroy the life of the ruler, and he applies his will and then deals with the consequences of horrible blood guilt that came after the application of his will. So when we talk about democracy or republics or tyrannies, all kinds of ways in which power is applied in the political realm, we have to understand individual countries and individual circumstances, and then in wisdom we have to see if they had a choice to act differently or if they had to comply in a set of circumstances in which they had no choice. They had to comply to either the will of another person or comply to the set of circumstances. And then what happened was that they had to deal either with good outcomes or bad outcomes. We have a situation like this in Russia after revolution in 1917, 1918. Many people loved the royal aspect of Russia. They didn't want to change it. But then massive military conflict unfolded, and many people were forced to compliance, and they couldn't apply their will because there was nothing they could select freely. They had to comply to a set of circumstances that was happening at that time. So when we look at Russia today and we want to be fair, we cannot just attack it for certain choices when there was no possibility to make those choices. You had to yield to the waves of fate that happened at that time. I'm one of those people who loves to read history and to understand motivations of leaders or people who participated in many events. And I realized that in many circumstances they had no choice. They only had one way to go. And that leads me to another point, and that is the way. Jesus Christ himself calls him the life, the truth, and the way. The way is one of the most complicated ideas and notions and concepts that we can deal with, because it shows not only the existence of something like life or existence of truth, it shows the fact that there is motion and destiny. So I always ask for divine destiny, because I believe that divine destiny is always in my favor and always is in your favor, because it comes from perfect love of our Father in heaven. But there are other kinds of destinies that come from other kinds of ways. And when we look, for instance, at the destiny of the whole world, we see that it can be compelled to destruction by inferior forces than divine destiny, or the earth can develop in divine ways, because God's love and God's mercy and God's grace can be applied to the earth's destiny. And the same is about particular countries, leaders, nations, territories. So, in order for us to have sophisticated way of evaluating choices in the will, we have to first have a very good understanding of what is it that the will can select. Are there certain things that are not subject to the will because there is no choice there, there is nothing to select? And I think that profound understanding of this truth will lead us to be lovingly patient with each other. Because today there is a lot of judgmental destruction of each other's opinions. There is this strange demand for agreeing, that one person has to agree to another person's opinion or they cannot be in contact. And that is a situation in which the will to freedom, the will to liberty cannot be applied. Because if you don't have anything to select in conversation, like disagreements, arguments, debates, development of all kinds of new knowledge, then there's nothing there that can be willed. It becomes a matter of requirement for total compliance, and then there is no will. And it's very interesting that some of the most repressive people who do that to each other tend to talk about democracy, but then they don't behave like people who participate in a process in which they can access and connect to individual wills of diverse people who are part of that conversation, because they immediately exclude anyone who doesn't agree with them. That is very, very strange way of thinking about the will when there is actually no way to apply it. Because if someone demands agreement and there is no selection to disagree that would keep that person in the company, then there is obviously no democracy. There is just this pure compliance. And I think that in order for us to break away from this strange situation in which people ban each other, in which people throw invectives, throw bad words at each other while thinking that they do a good thing, is not going to lead us into any friendly context of social communication. So we have to be very intelligent about the way we address this issue, and I'm just opening up conversation about it, but I know that many of you are extremely highly educated, that you have knowledge in philosophy, you have knowledge in linguistics, you have a lot of life experience, and you can help me and you can contribute to this conversation about the need to develop complex understanding about the relationship between what is sphere of the will and what is fate, destiny, or forceful compliance force.